Hi, this is Gib Parrish, and today I'm going to provide an example of health determinants using smoking and lung cancer. This is a fairly complicated graphic that shows the natural history of and selected influences on tobacco use and lung cancer. It attempts to demonstrate the various kinds of factors which are up here that influence a person's decision whether or not to actually smoke, and then in turn that influences the person's health, which is detailed down here in the bottom. I'm going to explain the upper section of this graphic, the determinants, in a little bit, but the first thing I want to do is focus on this lower section here and just show you what that represents. So here we are looking at a sort of a blow-up of the smaller, or the lower section of the graphic, which talks about the fact that there shows a population, and within the population there's a birth of an individual, and in the life course of that person there are various negative as well as positive and preventive factors influencing that person's health, and that if these factors are mostly positive and preventive, we have a healthy individual that goes on, lives life, and dies from some particular cause eventually. On the other hand, if there are negative influences on health, the person may develop some sort of a subclinical illness first, then clinical illness where there actually are signs or symptoms of a particular disease, and in this case we are thinking about lung cancer in particular, or other tobacco use related diseases. After developing the illness, the person usually goes on to develop chronic illness and eventually may die from that particular disease itself. And there are influences along the way on the person and whether or not they develop subclinical illness initially. Even if are negative influences first, the person may, with other influences, perhaps screening and effective treatment, may actually move from this disease course down back to a more healthy individual course, and die from causes other than the illness of interest, or the one that we're talking about today. Now, what we're going to do next is I'm going to now go back to the larger graphic and show some examples of specific parts of that. And to do that, we're going to now get rid of the PowerPoint there, and actually we have now a web browser window here showing this graphic again, and it turns out that some of the parts of this particular graphic are in fact hyperlinked, and so that we can in fact show you some data or some evidence that relates to each of these. Let me point out that there are many different influences here on health, and the line that outlines a particular box, which is an influence. Each one of these boxes represents an influence on health, incidentally. And the line outlining the box is color-coded to represent whether it is a cultural influence, economic, green is environmental, sort of orange is genetic and nutritional, purple is healthcare, red political and governmental, and blue is social and behavioral influences. So for example, we have cultural norms and values within a given society, and those in turn have an impact on sort of the political context, economic context, social networks, family and peers within that society. And then, for example, the economic context itself may further influence tobacco companies themselves and whether or not they sell products, how well they are able to sell those products. The political context may impact laws and regulations related to, for example, the sale or use of tobacco products. There may be taxes put into place which may in fact reduce the sales of tobacco products, as an example. The extent to which laws and regulations put into place are enforced is also another factor. So these are all various kinds of influences, and this shows their sort of interrelationships. It's a complicated picture. But let me just show you an example of how we can then click on some of these different influences and get some additional information. For example, here's a box that says tobacco companies, and they're obviously a part of the environment here. And if we click on that box, then it brings up the website for the R.J. Reynolds Company, which you can explore and see how they present information to their audience. Now we will go back to the graphic. There's a box here which is pro-smoking media or ads, and those would typically be produced and paid for by tobacco companies. If we click on that, then we see this actually brings us to the Legacy Tobacco Documents Library, which in fact has a whole lot of examples of different kinds of materials created by tobacco companies related to advertising, manufacturing, sales, etc. of tobacco products. Another example might be social networks and how they might influence social and behavioral practices that in turn may influence whether or not a person actually uses tobacco products. And let me show you up here, back up to social networks. If we click on that, that will bring up for us a very interesting article recently published by Nicholas Christakis and others concerning how a large social network influences the smoking dynamics within that network, within the individuals within that network, and it includes also a nice graphical display. So you can go to this article and explore that further. Let me just point out here that from a given box there are arrows proceeding to other boxes, and each of these arrows is intended to show the influence of a particular factor on another factor, or alternatively on an actual activity or practice. This practice here, which is tobacco product use or smoking, for example, has many arrows going into it. For example, there's an arrow that feeds into it from the social and behavioral influences. The availability of a place to smoke feeds into it. Tobacco product availability and sales feeds into it. The availability and access to effective smoking cessation programs feeds into it. Now, some of these factors may actually tend to increase a person's tobacco product use or the likelihood of that use, whereas some other factors may in fact tend to decrease or limit that use. For example, Another arrow extends into the tobacco use box from counseling by a health provider to quit smoking. There may, if that happens, there may be an influence, and if that influence is positive, a reduction in tobacco use, or in fact a person not starting that in the first place. So those are some examples of the inputs, if you will, to smoking itself from this graphic. Now, tobacco use itself, in other words smoking, has its own outputs and influences on other aspects of this graphic. So tobacco product use itself isn't one of many, of course, influences on health, so it feeds into here. And then in this particular case, if a person is smoking, typically that would be a negative influence and may in fact be a factor in a person developing subclinical illness, and in particular, for example, a lung cancer. Now, tobacco use itself may also feed into here, which is indoor air pollution or secondhand smoke, so that the use of tobacco products by some people may in fact produce an environment which is not healthy for people who themselves are not smoking but are breathing in secondhand smoke. And then that can become itself a hazard in the work or home environment, and that can also again influence health. There are other factors in addition to tobacco use or smoking which may in fact produce lung cancer, and those include asbestos and radon exposure. So those are indicated here as other factors. And again, if we click on this particular box, it brings up an article that illustrates a study looking at radon gas exposure in lung cancer that was published recently by researchers in Iowa. So what I've tried to do in this brief overview is to give you an introduction to an example of how factors can influence health using tobacco use and lung cancer. And I've tried to illustrate this with a particular graphical technique, and I've showed you some of the capabilities of the graphical technique here in terms of allowing you to see further information on the relationships of these different factors to both other factors, to activities, and to eventual outcomes. Thank you very much.